Hey, welcome back to PlayStation Live from E3. This is a segment I've been excited about all week long because I'm a huge nerd, and so is Zach Miner over there.
It's true.
So, immersive sim shooters, immersive experiences, whatever you want to call them, we're talking about games like Prey, BioShock, System Shock, Dishonored, Deus Ex. These are games that are I'm very passionate about, and I know a lot of folks out there are too, and they're coming back in a big way. So we wanted to get some great designers in here to sort of talk about where it's all going. So we've got a hell of a roundtable lined up here. We've got Warren Spector. Welcome, Warren.
Thank you, good to be here.
You were producer on the original System Shock. You were lead on, if I recall, on Deus Ex, the original Deus Ex, and now you're charting a new course with System Shock 3, which I am dying to learn a lot more about, by the way.
Well, it's good to be back in a universe that I worked on 23 years ago.
It's special.
It is. I mean, people still care. It blows my mind.
We've got Harvey Smith, who also worked on the original Deus Ex in a major role. Dishonored with Arcane, Dishonored 2. A lot of great stuff coming there, so it's great to have you. And you two work together on Deus Ex.
We worked together off and on for 9 years.
Yeah.
I cut my teeth with this guy.
This is the lead designer on Deus Ex. It wouldn't have been Deus Ex without him.
Oh, it's tremendous to have you folks here. And then we also have Daryl Long. You're working on Far Cry 5. Now, what's interesting, I think, about Far Cry 5 and how it kind of enters this conversation is you might not initially make that connection that it's so related to these games, but I think if you really peel back the layers, you'll see it's very consistent in so many ways. So it's great to have you with us.
It's great to be here. Thanks.
That's great.
And I know Rafael Colantonio, whose most recent game is Prey, wanted to be here, but his flight had to leave. He also worked on Arx Fatalis, Dark Messiah, Dishonored 1 with me.
And those are also games that are very much in this world. So it's one I'm very passionate about. And Warren, I thought we might start with you because you were producer on the original System Shock, which was a seminal title. Came out in '94.
Yeah.
And you know, at the time, you and your team kind of created a genre in a way. And I'm curious your thoughts on that and what was in your mind at the time, looking at the shooters that were out there and kind of how you put that all together.
Well, it actually started with Ultima Underworld, which came out, what was it, 2-3 years earlier.
Yeah.
The very first fully textured 3D first-person real-time game that combined a little bit of systems simulation, a little bit of physics, you know. So it started out with Underworld, but System Shock, it really started when Paul Neurath and Doug Church and I just sort of lamented the fact that we'd been pigeonholed in this fantasy universe for so long and decided that if we had to make another game that featured guys in chainmail and swinging big swords, we would have to kill ourselves. So we knew we wanted to make a science fiction game. But looking around at all the other shooters at the time, they were all these incredibly fast-paced, you know, skill-driven, scripted experiences. And because of our experience working on Ultima games and Underworld and games like that, we wanted to kind of slow things down, build a more systemic approach, let players express themselves through their play choices. So very, very different. You know, in the classic shooters of that time, your only decision is what gun do I use to kill that thing with? And we wanted players making much more sophisticated choices, I guess.
Yeah, limited ammo, limited supplies, doing what you can with what you got are hallmarks of this genre. Harvey, you know, I'm sure you played the original System Shock as well as Ultima Underworld.
I would say that Underworld was the game that brought me into the industry.
Oh,
honestly.
interesting.
I played Underworld in '92 or something, '93.
Yeah.
And I thought that it was made fully in Austin, and so I moved to Austin and got a job in the QA department.
And then you were totally disappointed.
And then I realized it was made in Boston and Austin together, collaborating. Mostly the developers were in Boston.
Yeah.
Warren would fly back and forth or work with them remotely. But nonetheless, Warren was there, and once the new game, System Shock, I was in the QA department. Once it came into test, I went to my boss, Kay Gilmore, and I just begged. I was like, who do I have to kill to work with these guys on this game that's like Underworld? And so, because we did the floppy and the CD back together, that was a 10-month, for me in QA, that was a 10-month gig of just playing the game, and it was fantastic.
Well, the thing, you probably don't even remember this, but one of the most amazing things was you'd be there at like 2 or 3 in the morning, and I would come down there, and I remember talking to you about games and game design, and I got a really good sense of your sort of philosophical leanings and that you got this kind of game. And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to work with you so much and wanted to yank you out of QA as quick as I could.
Yeah, when we would sit and, I mean, I'm all about quality of life when possible, but like, man, I was burning to work on these kinds of games, so we both worked a lot of hours. And there would be often these times when all the lights were out and all the cubicles were dark, but there would be one glow from the cubicle of, you know, somebody working on this game. People who worked on System Shock really loved it. And we would sit for long periods of time and talk and just come to some sort of sympathetic understanding of what is making this game so special, because these games do feel special. They get into your blood in a way, you know?
Exactly. You realize with every game you make, you're building on it, you're learning. And I mean, you talked before about doing a post-mortem long after the game was actually finished. I mean, but we're always looking back and reflecting on what we created and realizing that there are different ways that we can bind these things together and different ways we can give player opportunities and constantly expanding the opportunities we're giving our players so they can express themselves.
Yeah, I like that expression remark because I think that's also a hallmark of these titles, and we have almost like a spectrum here with you folks. Like Far Cry, especially Far Cry 5, which looks insane. It takes some of the basics of this formula, but it blows it up at a scope and a scale that we haven't seen. So it's a huge open world. There's vehicles, there's characters, there's all this stuff. But there's an immense ability to express yourself in the way that you play the game. So I thought that might be interesting to talk about.
Yeah, when we were beginning the project and we were looking at, okay, what can we do that's going to make Far Cry 5 really push the boundaries of what Far Cry is? We said, okay, the DNA of Far Cry is an outpost. You know, that you go to the outpost, you can attack it from any angle. It's 360 degrees, and you choose whether you're going to do long-range stealth or go in full-on Rambo assault. And then we said, how can we take that idea and extend it to the entire game? We really wanted to give players the opportunity to go into the world in any direction from the beginning of the game and decide how they're going to push forward the story themselves. And it created a huge challenge for our writers because they need to be able to write a story where when you choose to engage in it, it still advances, it still moves forward, and players feel there is something that they can chase in the game, but that there isn't really a single red line in the game of story. So these guys, they're the whole writing team. We've got like 6, 8 people on the writing team right now, all trying to figure out how do we build a story where the player is engaging in story bubbles whenever they choose.
Yeah, it's incredibly hard to write dialogue for this kind of game because you don't actually know what players are going to do. The power of this kind of game is the players get to play the way they want to and solve problems the way they want to and interact with the world the way they want to. So you can't even anticipate what they're going to do. You have to anticipate. Well, it's impossible. You just can't do it. I mean, you were talking earlier about a conversation that was only going to affect, one person out of a million,
Yeah, we saw people tweeting about a conversation in Deus Ex 1 where you help a woman whose cats are being killed by these monsters called greasels. And if the guy, for the first time in all these years, backtracked through a bunch of radioactive waste to get back to her, and she has a follow-up conversation, which he never realized she had, and just a level of detail. When you start trying to simulate the way people would react, that's where you run into problems. I mean, famously, we've talked about the example in Deus Ex 1 where we had this device called a LAM that was like a proximity mine. You could either throw like a grenade or attach to the wall, and it was a physical object that stuck out a short distance on the wall, and because you could attach one, you could hop up onto it and attach another one and hop up onto it, reach down, pick up the first one. You could just keep placing them and climb, and that's fine, that's cool, that's some sort of emergent thing we didn't anticipate. It allowed the players to escape the world or climb walls. But if you imagine a human ally standing around, like, what are you doing? Come on, let's go, as we often do in games now. What would he say to that? We never anticipated it. He wouldn't have lines to that. Are you climbing the wall using magnetic mines that you've attached to the brick? Like, what's going on? How do magnetic mines attach to the brick, by the way? I mean, like, we'd have to write this exploding permutations of conversation. We just couldn't do it.
And you would spend the rest of your life working on that game.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, the classic example in the original Deus Ex is using the AUG to boost your strength really high up, grabbing couches, stacking them, jumping over places into places you're not supposed to go. But that's so much of the fun, you know?
I remember our AI programmer coming to us, Scott Martin.
Yeah.
And I still interact with him on Facebook. And I remember him coming to us and saying, wait a second, guys, the way the RPG system works, I can max out my strength, pick up a Coke machine, and block the door with it, and the AI doesn't know what to do with it. And so at the last minute, I think some designers had it set so that it was destructible, but maybe with the wrong particles, so an AI could run into the Coke machine and explode it. Other people were just trapped by it. I mean, it was, what do you do with all these options?
Well, great, pointing out all the bugs, terrific.
We've been looking at how do we get the AI to be able to do everything that the player can do. And that's kind of our way of solving that problem is if the AI could move the Coke machine too or something. But
yeah.
You know,
but don't you then spin into a bunch of animations?
Well, that's what
Where's
exactly
the guy
it.
position himself to grab the Coke machine? How does he grab it? Like, that sounds crazy. You know?
Yeah, I think you do everything the player do. It's like the holy grail.
Yeah.
We introduced a new system where the AI, you can break their morale and they'll run away. So you're attacking a location and suddenly one of them will decide to flee. Perfect. And you never know what they're going to do because they can use most of the, well, especially the vehicles in the world. And when they go and they jump into the helicopter that you just arrived in and then they fly away with it, and you're like, but you just took my ride. Wow. And the player's stranded somewhere. And the thing is, they also need to have a purpose, right? They need to have a reason to do that. So when they go, I mean, they need to look around in the world for enemies to bring in as reinforcement. And that, it's the whole animation thing. Like everything we're fighting against is this, you know, the fractal of animation, the fractal of dialogue. When you're guns for hire or talking about the things you're doing in the world, like your example, I mean, it's tens of thousands of lines just to understand what the player is doing and to be the narrator of their story.
I really like this approach some people have used where the first line of dialogue is voice recorded and spoken, but then it fades to text after that, and you kind of don't even notice it, but you can read text very quickly, and it's very flexible. You can work on it until the last minute of the project, except for translations.
Yeah.
One thing I was going to say, though, about the explosion of, you know, decision-making trees, man, like, I remember on Deus Ex 1, we had mirrors, right? It was pretty easy to set up a mirror, and it facilitated a few interesting moments, either narratively or gameplay-wise. We took J.C. Denton at some point and put him in a prison cell, took his guns away. And he's inside the prison cell, and the glass is mirrored. He's looking at himself. And Anna Navarre walks up and hits a switch on the outside of it. It's a cyberpunk game, right? And the mirror changes to glass so you can see her. Behind the scenes, we're just moving a mirrored sheet out of the way. And that was fine back then because visual fidelity was so low. If you hopped up on the table, you're kind of crouched, you're kind of like in a weird position. Your feet are floating off of the table because part of your collision box is on it, part's not. But as soon as the graphical fidelity went up to where we're looking at characters, they look really good, we just can't put mirrors in games because there's so many different things they could be holding or leaning positions or the way that...
breaks the immersion.
When they jump up on the coffee table, they'd need to be on it in a way that your eye thinks is proper. And so it's unfortunate, but like, that visual fidelity actually hurts what you can actually do in the game.
And mirrors can be such a powerful narrative device too, so that's a shame. Yeah. Maybe we should rename this roundtable The Death of the Mirror in the Modern Video Game.
Yeah.
Now Warren, what I think is really interesting about this is you've been on an adventure for the last 5 to 10 years. You've been working with Disney, and doing some stuff with Disney, great games. But what lured you back into this genre with System Shock 3? I find that very interesting.
Well, it's kind of a long story, which I'll try and sum up as briefly as possible. After Junction Point shut down, I decided I needed some different challenges, different things to do, so I went into teaching. I built a game development program at the University of Texas and did that for 3 years.
I would take that class in a heartbeat.
Well, I think we did right by our students. They all have jobs anyway. But about midway through that, I sort of looked in the mirror and said to myself, wow, teaching is great, the students are great, but I've got to make something. And so at the end of my 3-year commitment, I was advising Paul Neurath, who was the founder of Looking Glass, on his new venture, Other Side Entertainment. And one day we were having a little meeting, and he just looked at me and he said, you know, I got the rights to System Shock back. And I looked at him and completely joking, I said, you know, well, I should make that for you. And 2 weeks later, he called me back and said, you should make that for me. And the world is so rich, and Shodan is such an amazing character, and there's still so much interest in that world and in the game that it seemed like the perfect way to jump back in and get back into development. So
glad you did. And also, I'd be remiss if I didn't say one of Warren's students actually works with us and worked on Prey.
And Prey is fantastic. It's a wonderful entry in this genre. Has a lot of innovation onto itself. And what do you guys think? It seems like it's back in vogue. I mean, obviously Ken Levine with BioShock, BioShock Infinite, that really kind of got this genre kind of kickstarted a little bit again. But we've got Dishonored, we've got, you know, System Shock 3's on the way. They're making a System Shock remake. I mean, there's a lot of these games. Far Cry is crushing. So I mean, what do you think? Why has this suddenly become just sort of groundswell of support, like a Broadway?
You know, I think more importantly to me is that some of the elements that we were champions of, I guess, have moved into other types of games. I mentioned earlier, I know it's a zombie game, but like State of Decay was one of my favorite games, not for the fictional subject material, but all the crazy emergent narrative things that could happen in that game, the number of stories that players were telling each other that were completely driven by systems. And on top of that, they did that cool base building feature, and you have to you have to collect survivors and keep them working together and move them from place to place. It's just a really smart game. And I see in it many of the elements that when Looking Glass was doing them, they were not in most games. Even Origin, some of the Ultima games had those features.
That's what I was going to say was, you know, this style of game really came into its own at Origin and Looking Glass long time ago. And there came a point where Looking Glass shut down, and there were many tears shed that day. But I told the folks up there and friends who were really moved by that, you know, no, this is a good thing in a very strange way, because Looking Glass was like a little dandelion, you know, but it was this place where all this amazing stuff happened, and then the wind blew. And Looking Glass shut down, and all of these little dandelion seeds went all over the industry. And so you get Irrational, you get Arcane, you get Ion Storm, you get all of these companies, you know, and
the Trespasser team.
Okay.
We work with Austin Grossman on. We work with Austin Grossman on the Dishonored games. I love him. He's an original System Shock guy.
Awesome. A
friend of ours. He's an amazing guy. And every now and then we talk about the dandelion effect that Warren's talking about. I never heard it called that, but let's call it that. The dandelion effect.
Okay.
I like that. Where he's right, like seeding different parts of the industry, and the ambition and scope of Trespasser, physics-driven. iCave movement, all of that. It's just an example. Whether the games work perfectly or not, they're ambitious experiments. And it's just an example of how, like, crazy ahead of the curve some of the people that were working at Looking Glass 100%. Actually were.
Yeah, speaking of that, Zach was talking to me backstage about kind of VR and how a lot of these games, in a weird way, if you think about it, were sort of, they're simulations of reality and in a way that hadn't really been seen. So why don't you...
Yeah, I'm curious, you know, certainly, you know, Far Cry games and a lot of the Dishonored games are told almost entirely in the first person, right? You never kind of break that perspective for the most part. Obviously, VR, you know, puts you right into, you know, those eyes, and you kind of see what the character is seeing. So I'm curious if you guys, as designers, are interested in kind of exploring the possibilities of VR, or if you want to wait a little bit.
The original System Shock in 1994 supported the 2 VR headsets.
Wow.
Really?
I didn't know that.
The Forte VFX1 and the Cybermax. This is not the first time VR has come around to save the game business, right?
Right.
So we were playing around with it back then when the optics were seriously bad and head tracking was seriously bad. Right. Everything was seriously bad. The headsets would get so hot that they'd start smoking and eventually catch on fire.
Nice.
Yeah, it was exciting. It was a good time. But yeah, these games definitely lend themselves to that.
It's a good example, I think, of where the technology is starting to catch up to our ambition as designers, right? Like I feel that we've been limited a lot. Like when we're trying to build an open world, we just can't fit it in memory. Or in the animation example that you gave before, we don't have the production capacity to create all the animation that we want to create. So as we're maturing as an industry and maturing as designers, the technology is always trying to play catch up with us. And I think VR is a good example too, where it's another way to bring more immersion to the player, and we're going to have to play with that and see how far we can take it.
Yeah, I'm curious, you guys spend so much time designing kind of a massive possibility space for the player. Is it ever frustrating when you see players who, find the way that they want to play this game and stick on like a very kind of narrow line? And how do you try and kind of encourage them to explore kind of different, options for getting through areas?
Yeah, we did this every now and then. We're afforded the opportunity to do some testing. So for Dishonored 1, a bunch of us sat in a dark room through a one-way glass watching 10 players play the game over and over, eating pizza and taking a break and talking to a moderator. And one of the best moments was they finished playing and they moved to the other room. We switched to the other one-way mirror, watching them like, evil psychologists watching an experimental group.
Oh, yeah.
And the first guy who spoke was like, I was really disappointed in the mission that we played tonight because the material we read before we got to play said that you could do things many different ways, and all I did was do this and this and this. And the other guy at the table, one of the others, was like, oh, I didn't go there at all. I went here instead and I did this. And a third person at the table, she raised her hand and she was like, I didn't kill the guy at all. I found another way to get rid of him. And we were just like, yes.
Yeah.
But that points to a problem because like those guys in one single playthrough, even though it's a nonlinear space, those guys did not realize that there were many different possibilities. They were playing on a line because most video games had trained them to do that.
Right.
Now games are more and more open and more systems driven. So I hope with Breath of the Wild and things like that, I hope people are realizing we should be making games that are all about expression and doing it your way, I think.
Well, but you don't really want players thinking about, oh, look, I can fight or sneak or talk, at this point. You don't want them thinking about that. You want them finding their own fun.
Right.
Being.
Right.
Yeah.
You want their play style to matter. I mean, that's kind of the two-word summary of what I do for a living. Play style matters. But you don't want them thinking about it. You just want them, if one player likes shooting their way past every problem, go ahead and shoot. If you want to sneak, sneak. And find your own fun. That's the key. I mean, frankly, part of the reason why Deus Ex exists at all is because I was working with the Thief team, and there was a pointed thief that was just too hard for me. I could not sneak past that damn guard. And I said to the team, let me fight this guy. And they said, no, if we let you fight, if we make you strong enough to fight, everybody's just going to fight because that's what games have trained people to do. And I said to myself, I can make a game that lets you fight or sneak, And that way you find what you find fun, I guess. And once they buy the game, it's really kind of theirs, you know. As long as they're having fun, more power to them.
Yeah, it's totally okay if they don't realize that there's other options until they're standing around the water cooler the next morning talking about how they played the game or how they finished the game and realize, really, you had that or you saw that? And that's totally okay. I mean, what I find in our playtest when we're watching people play, the thing that actually drives people to try different play styles is running out of ammo. Mm-hmm. And so they realize,
I mean, even way back in the day, the first time I heard the word resource economy, I think, was probably in the test pool for System Shock. And, people would come in, they were familiar with Wolfenstein or Doom, great games, but they would say, hey, why do I only have 5 shots for the EMP rifle? I want more. But if you had more, you would be able to just blow everybody away. You'd never have to hack or whatever, So, yeah, it's a really good point. That's one way to constrain people. All these tricks we've picked up over the years for encouraging people to at least look around and realize that there are more options available to them.
And it's so much more meaningful to have the player discover that for themselves, right? When I'm playing a Far Cry game and I throw a grenade and then I realize that it can roll down a hill, it can set a field on fire, which then alerts the militia in the nearby town. Like that means so much more than if a tooltip had told me, hey, think about maybe catching fire to the grass, right?
I think that's part of the fun of these games too. Is as the player, doing something like that and appreciating the fact that the designers thought about that and that they recognized it. But for you guys, it's kind of the other way around. You're seeing players do things you never even
I remember there are two real amazing examples of that in my life. One was on Ultima 6, actually, before Underworld even came out, or System Shock. I was watching a tester, a guy named Mark Shafkin. He was in a spot where he was on one side of a portcullis, and there was a lever that you had to flip to raise the portcullis, which meant you needed the telekinesis spell. And he didn't have the telekinesis spell at that point. So I was watching him going, oh, you're toast. You're not getting through there. And then he had a character in his party named Sherry the Mouse, who was little, because she was a mouse. And he sent Sherry under the portcullis. She flipped the lever. The portcullis went up. I fell on the floor and said, I'm doing that for a living for the rest of my life. It was a total accident. It was not planned. He did something that no one else in the world had ever done.
Even the developers didn't think about that?
No, it never done it. And then
Wow.
on Deus Ex, another similar thing. A year after we shipped, I watched one of our testers demonstrating the game for a bunch of executives. Now, why they needed a demo of a game that shipped a year earlier, we'll leave that aside. But no, he was in a place, it was in the Statue of Liberty, in fact, and I knew what problem he was trying, which Harvey built. He was trying to solve a problem. I knew what problem he was trying to solve. There were three little problems all in one space.
Yeah, Mike's giving us a little difficulty, so you can use that.
Okay. I feel like I should start singing now or
Now
something.
you're on stage.
Anyway, there were three problems all sort of in the same area, and with one shot from the pistol, he solved all three problems. And I mean, and I saw him setting all of these things up, moving an explosive barrel here, getting back and hiding in this one spot. And again, I just fell on the floor because I know for a fact that no one had ever done that before. Players discovering solutions to problems themselves. That's what this is all about. That's the magic.
Yeah, and I think I love that. And I think it points to one of the problems we have, which is these games come alive when you play a second time. I moved back from France 4 months ago to Austin, and I came in just at the right time to give a bunch of alpha beta feedback to the Prey team. And so I wrote tons of notes like I always do. I played 2 playthroughs back to back, about 70 hours total. I played the first time with no psi powers, only human skills, engineering, and such. The second time I played with no human skills, only psi powers. Anyway, long story short, the surface complexity of the game is such that you have so many things to learn in terms of UI. What does it mean to dismantle this? Like, what do I get for that? Like, how do I buy that? Like, what does security stations mean in the world? Like, all of these things you're dealing with. What's the story? Where am I? Who am I? That the second playthrough, when you're free from all of that, because it's just intuitive now, is like a sublime experience. And it's very hard to get people to play a game a second time. A very small percentage actually do, because they know the story, they've beaten that game, so they're ready to move on to something else. But when they do, when you can encourage them to do that, they come to us and they tell us, I've never been affected by anything like that, And so the fact that people play Deus Ex over and over, or System Shock 2, or Thief, you're talking about games that had a relatively small splash when they hit. Probably most of the immersive sims are like that. Deus Ex, Bioshock, and Dishonored might be the exceptions. But you're talking about games that have had way disproportionate influence because people in the know, game designers, play them over and over, and they have these magical experiences that they just keep talking about,
Yeah, the challenge for us is getting the player into the mastery zone as quick as possible, right?
Yeah.
To the point where they're comfortable with all the systems. And now we have so many systems or so many gadgets or so many tools in the game that players, they do sometimes, back to your point earlier, they tend to isolate themselves and start using the same tool again and again.
Yeah.
And the magic comes when they start to intersect all the systems together. And we need to push them. We need to find ways to push them and expose those systems as quickly as possible without overwhelming them with choice.
The interesting thing is we think of games as, the interactive medium, and yet most games have trained people not to think.
Yeah.
There's sort of this illusion of interactivity, and obviously what we do is a lot of smoke and mirrors, but I think in this style of game, we're at least pushing the boundaries a little bit and asking players to think, which is probably part of the reason why they haven't sold as well as some other games. the truth that dare not be spoken is that games are work. And it may be that our games are a little bit more work than some other simpler games.
It's really refreshing to see people playing Breath of the Wild and experimenting. Like, hey, I don't have the thing that I need to get in there yet, but what if I tried this? You know, it's really nice.
That kind of experimentation that players can go through will lead to those eureka moments when they suddenly solve the problem, and that's what makes it special to them. Yeah.
Now, where do we think this this genre or these mechanics and these elements? What do you think the next frontier is for them?
You know, when I heard that we were doing this, by the way, I didn't know we were doing this until yesterday. I immediately had this thought that I wanted to actually ask these guys about, because it's a pressing thought I had, which is, it's tempting to think that like the way this subgenre of games should go is continue to get big and action oriented on the commercial side, the AAA side.
No.
But on the indie side, just to eschew all of that and go down into a closed system where every part of the system feeds into something else. It's like a looped economy or whatever, where you can influence the AI in a bunch of different ways. The AI has needs and wants. Just to go dump all the graphics, dump the big story, and go deeper and deeper into what an immersive sim means. And that might even be like a smaller environment to play in. Clearly, there's a way they could split that services different types of players. But I'd really love to see the indie version of immersive sims go that way.
That's a really fascinating concept. It makes me think of something you used to talk about years ago. Your dream game, you wanted to make the one city block. Remember that? I still think about that. I think I love that idea of like reduce the scope and maybe even throw out the graphics and the story, but get really dense with it. Have incredible detail in those
Well,
loops and mechanics.
there are two ways to approach this sort of game. You can go inch deep and miles wide, or you can go miles deep and an inch wide.
Yeah.
And I think I'd prefer doing the inch wide, miles deep simulation. That's where I want to start pushing a little bit more. Is, you know, really go deeper on the simulation. You know, not just physics, but in terms of the small rule sets that interact with one another. And then actually, I think we do have some work to do on the AI side to allow or make the AI such that it'll actually respond to player input in a more robust and sophisticated way. So those are the two things I'd like to push, but not the one-block role-playing game. I don't think anybody's crazy enough to give me the money to do that.
I love that idea.
I do too, but no one's crazy enough to give me the money.
Because you would really get to know that one block. You would get to know it like the back of your hand. And that's a powerful concept.
That is true. Tell the folks here at E3 that there's someone out there who wants the money to make that.
Fund that game, folks. Fund that game. Daryl, from your perspective, you're obviously, you know, you have in terms of scope and scale and action quotient, I think it's safe to say Far Cry 5 is going to be at the top of the pecking order. But from your perspective, looking at just all these systems working together, this style of game, where do you see it going?
I think the frontier will be AI. I completely agree. Like, AI is a big buzzword right now. People are talking about using the cloud for AI and things like that. So the AI will always be limited by its ability to express itself in the game, whether it's through animation or dialogue. And it's up to us to figure out, okay, how do we can make AI that are smart enough to do incredible things, but then we don't have maybe the memory on the machine, or we don't have the ability for that AI to actually show it. So I think finding ways to sort of outsource or crowdsource the way the AI works so that they can challenge the player in new ways. I mean, an AI companion, we've all tried that, right? We've all tried to put an AI companion in the game. So how can we make it so that AI companion actually does act as the one who, especially in a first-person game where maybe you don't talk inside the game, how does the AI companion talk for you so that you see your effect on the world?
What strikes me, too, is that subject matter might be another area of, and theme might be another area of innovation, another frontier. I mean, Far Cry 5, I think, is tackling some very interesting issues. I'd be very curious to see how you guys do that. But, you know, I was playing the original Deus Ex recently, and it struck me, first of all, the game is just riddled with this conspiracy theory stuff that came about because of, Y2K and all of that at the time. But the game's also a lot funnier than I remember. It has a really good sense of humor about itself. I mean, even System Shock, it's about man and machine and just interesting themes, and I think those are frankly integral. The system stuff is wonderful too, but I think it's the themes as well that really help drive this.
Yeah, we spent a lot of time with the Dishonored games. I mean, it's been the last 8 years of my life exclusively working on Dishonored stuff, which is now coming to a close with the death of the Outsider. But we spent a lot of time talking about abuse of power as a theme, layered in many different ways. In our game, some people live behind a dumpster in an alley, and other people live in a aristocratic apartment with gold-plated bathrooms. Some people can afford elixir for the plague. All their friends get the rich people get the elixir. Nobody else does. Everybody else dies of the plague. Supernatural powers concentrated in one person's hand. Do they abuse it, or do they protect the vulnerable with it? Those themes in many different ways are worked through the Dishonored games, and so at least we were thinking about it.
The interesting thing to me, though, is not that there's a theme that you tell players about.
Right.
In movies and books. What you get is the author, the director, or whoever saying, here's what I think about this subject. In games, I think we have the ability to ask questions. It's not that we make statements. We ask questions, and in games like this, you get to explore those questions and answer them for yourself through your play. That's the real power of this for me. And with all the games that I work on, I don't even tell my teams about this half the time, but I always start with questions. Like on Deus Ex, what would happen if you threw a guy who believes in black and white and good and evil into a world that's all shades of gray? What would the world be like if every conspiracy people believe to be true were in fact true? In Epic Mickey, how important are family and friends to you? And no one in the world knows what I think about those questions. But as you play, every step you take and every action you take, you're answering it for yourself. You as a human, not your little avatar. And it's not me telling you stuff, it's me asking you to think about something.
I think my favorite conversation in Deus Ex is probably the one where Paul Denton, your brother, so it's an interesting relationship. It's not just some throwaway NPC that you're talking to, comes to you and somebody calls the NSF terrorists, and he says something to the effect that, one group calls them terrorists, somebody else calls them freedom fighters, and whether they're one or the other is just a matter of perspective. And I think that was like heady material for a game at the time, asking those questions. Now we have Cart Life and This War of Mine and things like that. We have really interesting games. One of my favorite games ever is Papers, Please, which through its systems makes you realize a bunch of stuff. Very powerful experience. Everybody should play Papers, Please. But at the time though, that was like I remember even me, like the ignorant guy growing up the way I did, it was an epiphany moment for me as well, so it's great.
What a fascinating conversation. I mean, that was a ton of fun, right, Zach?
Yeah, I'm happy to sit here and just be a pretty face for
Let's just keep going for the rest of the day. What do you think?
Why not?
Sure. We probably could.
We could do it.
We could do it. Unfortunately, all good things must come to an end at some point, and I really value the work that each of you has done in your careers. I think you're all luminaries, and you've left an indelible mark on the industry I love. So thank you so much for joining us here today.
Thank you.
Great.
Thanks for having us.
Absolutely. And we'll be back soon with more PlayStation Live from E3.
PlayStation